Ravi for his comments. I'd like to call now the third speaker, Bernard Math.
Speaker, Victor, at the very beginning of his whole sort of analysis, essentially stated that children at age 5 know what's best for themselves, and therefore the parents should give them the specialised education to achieve that sort of ultimate goal. So if a child, by their analysis, wants to be an astronaut, then by that logic, the parents would be so specialised on that basis that they will essentially forget about all the other necessary aspects to function in life, because that's what they predicated their analysis on, that somehow it is so unique for their style of education that it's acceptable to undermine everything else. The sort of analysis that Matt gave you in relation to social interactions, the sort of analysis that Cam gave you about the necessity for the benefit of all students in the school environment to get the best input, to get the best ultimate outcomes for children and society. So I have 3 questions I want to look at in today's debate. First of all, I want to look at this idea of the so-called rights balance, about whether in fact parents do have this unqualified right. Second of all, I'm going to take a look at this harm to children. And thirdly, I want to take a look at Ravi's sort of point, which was really asserted about parents are just going to feel attacked. So onto this idea of the rights balance. And these guys hung their case on 2 big fallacious assertions. The first one simply was there was a principle that parents have a right to choose whatever they do with their children until we see a clear, irreversible harm. Here is the clear, irreversible harm. Childhood development and education is just a one-shot thing. When you grow up in those formative years, you only have one shot to do it right. Because if you do it badly, there's very difficult abilities for children to come back in later years to have that social development, to actually have the well-grounded, balanced educational development. That is the problem with their analysis, because they effectively conceded that those parents will be engaging in sort of very specialised forms of education that may eventually fulfill the test at the end of the year. But the problem is that throughout the whole year, there's no ability to ensure that the curriculum is diverse enough and balanced enough to deal with all necessary aspects of teaching children, whether it's communication, actual analytical skills, and the ability to deal with the basic sort of areas of education. So we would say, ladies and gentlemen, that parents never have that unqualified right, because we recognise that education is such a clear and imperative thing for children from the very beginning, all the way until they graduate. But then they hung their second analysis, simply that citizens have always got a right to choose their conception of the good life. Well, we have a couple of responses to that. First of all, the good life assumes that everyone has an equal and fair, fully informed access to that opportunity. The problem with homeschooling is that it is that bias. There is a religious indoctrination, or a very specific form of what is the intellectual necessity for the educational outcome. When you necessarily take out that balance, you are not able to be fully informed on what is the conception of the good life, because you have nothing to compare yourself against. So what that's even effectively conceded is that, well, values that the parents really want to teach are going to be sidelined. Well, no, actually, ladies and gentlemen, when you get exposed to other values, it's through that rational discourse, that reasoning, that analysis, can people begin to understand why they want to prescribe themselves to a particular value, for what particular benefit that value holds to them in their self-actualization. We would say, moreover, though, ladies and gentlemen, is that social outcomes are best dealt with within that social context. When you remove someone out of that social context, and then they're unable to be able to understand the relative situations between particular individuals. We think teachers and even students themselves within a school context are better able to grasp that conception overall. But ultimately, which that house failed to recognise, what Cam gave you an analysis about ensuring school communities effectively deal with all the issues of children, is that poorer students who rely on state access to particular services, like disabled services, will inevitably miss out, because when you remove those children, especially with special needs, out of the state system, the state doesn't see a necessity to provide all the best resources to protect those that are most vulnerable, because ultimately you see that there's no necessity, the supply and demand factor at play. So we would say, ladies and gentlemen, a rights analysis would demonstrate that the state has every right to engage in this form of intervention. So on to this second idea about the harm to children. And there are three planks to their analysis. First of all, they simply said that, well, parents are best suited to help the children. It's a right to be subjective because they intimately know their children. Yeah, well, actually, ladies and gentlemen, sure, all of our parents think that we're really good and that we're all the best children in the world. And it's a very natural occurrence. The problem, though, is that the parent's conception is always isolated from another parent's conception to the teacher's conception. There is no ability to ensure that relativity. When you have no known form of competition, what it means is that it's too late at the end of the day with the tests, because you can't properly deal with the micro issues of people's educational ability. Moreover, we would say is that it ignored Cagg's analysis that if parents are that great in knowing their children's development, it's better to get them involved at the school level, to be where there are the most available resources, to target all of them, to collectively deal better with the issues so that everyone benefits at their maximum potential. Secondly, there's this issue simply that, well, children get better specialised education and that there's one-on-one education. They simply seem to assert that it's better because all of these youngsters are getting to university. Yeah, they are getting to university into very specialised courses, and that's what we're saying is so dangerous, because if you're going into very hardcore maths or sort of on those levels, you necessarily isolate yourselves from dealing with those other important sort of social activities. That's why we don't see 14-year-olds being able to very necessarily better socially interact at university level education. We think moreover, though, is that the parents' level of educational teaching is never fully objective enough or wide enough that the state's sort of mandated curriculum is able to afford. Because regardless of how schools eventually teach it, it ultimately means that the parents' way of dealing with it is always going to be more indoctrinated idea, and it doesn't allow children to fully understand why that sort of form of values teaching is necessarily the best form of values teaching. We think that the different ideas at play that schooling provides allows for children to rationally decide for themselves over time. Then there was this very third assertion that, well, children will just get bullied, which is 8 minutes at Victor's speech. What we would say is actually that social interaction is a better way of ensuring that, because at the end of the day, even after they come out of homeschooling, they're going to face the same pressures. And if you can deal with it at your formative years, you have a much better chance of overcoming it. So then we come very finally to deciding that parents will feel like they're attacked, and that their parents' philosophy is unbiased. Well, that assumes that children can't understand for themselves. But more importantly, is that it concedes the point that, well, the people we're talking about in homeschooling are the types of people who are subverting the state's right to engage in social policy and the need to ensure a balanced and fully equal access to opportunity for all children. But second of all, they simply said that parents will remove their children. Well, first of all, if they are at fringe, then they're not even going to interact with the state's sort of curriculum anyway. We don't think that's the case. But more importantly, they would be, because everyone is so concerned about childhood development, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of this debate, only the affirmative side stood by for important fundamental principles of the state's right to mandate in social policy and how it benefits children, and the parents don't have unqualified rights. This motion should stand.
Thank you, Matt, for these comments. I'd like to call now the third speaker for the negative and final substantive speaker of the debate. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we accept that childhood development is a one-shot thing. We accept that there are serious consequences when you don't get it right. For that reason, We were never willing to stand for a public system which could not guarantee the best outcomes for unique groups of students. Like maybe in Canberra, when you have like 5 kids going to school, you have enough disabled carers for everyone, you have unique personalised attention for people with specific weaknesses. That was completely unreal, ladies and gentlemen. Their assertiveness about homeschooling ignored how it actually works. That's going to lead to my first question. Which proposal delivers the best educational outcomes for children? Secondly, is it legitimate for the government to limit parental rights here? And basically their contention was the government limits some rights, so they should limit all rights. So that's ridiculous. Thirdly, which proposal is best for social cohesion? So which proposal delivers the best educational outcomes? We've heard from the opposition that the state needs to have control over teaching methods in terms of the way things are taught. We say that's ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen, for a number of reasons. Firstly, schools often have inadequate resources, ladies and gentlemen, for particular children. That's just the reality, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why, for example, for disabled kids or kids with learning difficulties, they often get left behind. And the reason for this isn't just a funding thing, it's a structural problem with schools. Right? And the reason for that is that schools are inherently majoritarian. Right? If you're a teacher for a class of 30, it's ridiculous for you to focus all your attention on the kid who's suffering the learning disability, on the kid who has serious social problems at home, ladies and gentlemen. That's a structural problem, which means that homeschooling is often necessary to deliver that kind of personalised attention which is needed, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that in the state school system, you often have huge classroom sizes, ladies and gentlemen, and that means that you get significant problems for talented kids, ladies and gentlemen, kids who need extension classes to further their development, ladies and gentlemen. We say that parents are enabled to actually provide that kind of specific education that kids need, and we're happy to support that, ladies and gentlemen. We heard from the opposition that this is going to lead to a distorted emphasis in teaching. It's going to lead to teaching of the wrong things. So firstly, we heard this is going to lead to, like, I don't know, evil maths professors disproportionately focusing on the wrong thing. Firstly, we don't think this happens that often, ladies and gentlemen. But even if it does, we say it's great for kids to specialise in particular areas. We say parents always encourage their kids to focus on particular careers, ladies and gentlemen, because that's their background, that's their skill set. We're happy to empower that, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, we heard this leads to an improper focus on religious education, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we accept that homeschooling is largely going to include more religious education than public schools, and we are completely happy to defend that. And the reason for that is that for religious kids, it's incredibly central to your identity to live your life in a religious way. And that means every facet of your life, ladies and gentlemen. That means it's incredibly confronting to have to go to a school where sex ed is taught, because that's attacking the core values which define your life. That's like a massive emotional impact, ladies and gentlemen, which occurs under a majoritarian system which is meant to cater for all people. We say we're happy to defend that. And what we heard from the opposition is that, like, kids are indoctrinated harmfully, ladies and gentlemen. We say firstly, indoctrination isn't going to change. When you have parents, having spent the majority of their lives with their kids are going to have a particular subset of values. So then once those values are threatened, once these kids are forced to go into the schooling system, that's incredibly harmful for their identity, ladies and gentlemen, incredibly harmful for their way to deliver their life. We say that's really harmful. Then we have the opposition that, like, homeschooling undermines the promotion of objective values. We just never heard what these objective values were. Like, we just reject that. We say in a liberal democracy, we support a plurality of values, ladies and gentlemen. Provided people don't break the law, we're happy for people to have different attitudes to life, ladies and gentlemen, which conforms with their own self-happiness, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we believe that the parents have the best capacity to deliver education. So second, is it legitimate for the government to limit parental rights here? Now, both teams agree that parental rights should be qualified in some instances, ladies and gentlemen. The key issue is where should the line be drawn. We've accepted the need for minimum standards, ladies and gentlemen, because we accept that kids need to know basic literacy and numeracy things to function in society, ladies and gentlemen. We're happy to defend that, but we weren't willing to go beyond that. And these are the reasons why, ladies and gentlemen. We said parents have incredibly unique advantages, ladies and gentlemen, in raising their kids. This is why we devolved power in the first place. This is Victor's material, but why we let parents make decisions about their kids' medical decisions, ladies and gentlemen, or their religious education, where they go to things like Sunday school. The reason for that is that they understand the specific needs of their kids, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, we recognise that parents have a right to raise their kids in a way that they see fit, to conform to the kind of people they want them to be long-term, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's really, really important. And we also say they recognise the specific strengths and weaknesses of kids. Like, a teacher isn't just able to discern that someone isn't that confident in a particular area, ladies and gentlemen. Like, parents are much more able to communicate with their children without that position of fear which occurs in a schooling system, ladies and gentlemen. And we're definitely the opposition that, governments can deliver the same outcomes, ladies and gentlemen. They can fund more disabled carers, we can do all these things. We say that was completely unrealistic, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, if you want to have more things like, more funding for disabled care, more pastoral care, ladies and gentlemen, we We say it's great to pull these kids out of those schools, because that allows us to stay more funding, ladies and gentlemen, to cater for the students who are still in these schools, and that's really important. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we say that this is exactly, that it's incredibly important that parents are given this power, ladies and gentlemen. So, moving on to the third thing. What is the best for the social, for social cohesion? So let's look at socialising children. And we heard from the opposition that, bullying can be really important in promoting happy development. We're wow, ladies and gentlemen, I think people like Sashi would disagree. We say, ladies and gentlemen, there's this incredibly emotional trauma associated with kids who aren't ready to go to school, being forced into that environment, ladies and gentlemen. And what kind of kids are we talking about? Often kids from marginalised and religious backgrounds, ladies and gentlemen. They look different, they sound different, they have different values. It's incredibly confronting to be in that school environment. That can be incredibly damaging to these kids, ladies and gentlemen. We say many kids aren't just ready for this kind of socialisation. And what this leads to is irreversible harm, the kind of harm they were talking about. We say bullying has huge long-term consequences, ladies and gentlemen. And we say this is why we defend the rights of parents. Because parents may know that their kids aren't in a position where they're ready to go out into the schoolyard and face this potential bullying, ladies and gentlemen. When they aren't in a position to actually, logically refute the kind of attacks they get about their penis size, ladies and gentlemen. So, if the kids can really respond to things like bullying, ladies and gentlemen, you need to be in a more emotionally stable place. And this is the point. They said, you know what, in the long term, it's actually good for these kids because that helps them equip them for later in life. We say you need to build that emotional stability in the first place before you can achieve that, ladies and gentlemen. We say you build up self-esteem in that comforting home environment that empowers people to go out into society and be happy, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, in terms of diversity, and the most sophisticated stuff we got from the opposition is tolerance is necessary. Great guys, we say diversity for diversity's sake is just not a helpful thing. And the reason for that is what I've already told you, that these kids often look different, they often may be marginalised, they often may be bullied, ladies and gentlemen. So simply having these kids in the schoolyard doesn't mean they're automatically accepted, doesn't mean there's more tolerance, doesn't mean there's more social awareness, ladies and gentlemen. And often these kids don't engage with other people because they're coming from a background, ladies and gentlemen, which is much more isolated. So we question whether all these benefits of diversity actually existed. Finally, within this theme, this idea of getting parents involved at the school level. The problem with the opposition is that they had a ridiculous characterization of what parents will do if we ban homeschooling. They basically said they're going to keep, engaging with teachers, going to parent-teacher meetings, promoting development within the school, ladies and gentlemen. We say that's ridiculous. We say parents who choose to be homeschooled believe that the school system is antithetical to what they want, the best outcomes for their children. We say this leads to undermining teachers, questioning the school system, which leads to worse education for the children. Because we say it's really important for kids to have consistent messages, ladies and gentlemen, about how to act at school, about how to learn, ladies and gentlemen. We say in the worst cases, parents will remove kids from other services, ladies and gentlemen, because this enhances the mistrust in the state, which is really harmful. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, we weren't living in fantasy land. We recognise the limitations of the schooling system. We recognise the unique advantages which parents have in catering for specific children. That's why we were so proud to oppose.
Alright, I'd like to ask now the reply speaker for the negative.
Speaker, the first affirmative told us there were three groups in this debate. What we told you was that there was a fourth that cut across all three of those. Parents who cared about their children. And parents who homeschooled them because the state system was failing to provide the needs of their children for one of any of the three reasons. Whether that was because they failed to provide for the religious education of their children, whether it failed to meet the educational needs of their children, or whether it failed to meet the social needs of children, who were in many cases bullied. This was a last resort. So this led us to two questions at the end of this debate. Which system does get the best outcomes for homeschooled children? Which system leads to the best outcomes for society as a whole? So let's talk about homeschooled kids. We told you that educationally, homeschooling could provide better outcomes because it could provide tailored education that recognised that each child was an individual. The first attack on this from the affirmative was that parents can't be objective and just being able to test at the very, very end of their education wasn't sufficient. There were a couple of things we said to this. The first of these is that we sampled the children's work by other teachers every year and that we rejected the assertion that you could keep faking tests forever. Secondly, We said that subjectivity was good, that when the type of subjectivity we were talking about was about catering to the individual learning needs of children, whether they be prodigies, whether they be intellectually disabled, was something that could always be done better in an environment where people who loved them could provide that education one-on-one. And finally, we pointed out right in my first speech that their system actually already recognised that the best educational methods were subjective, and that was why they allowed different schools to teach in different ways, something they conceded when they talked about Steiner schools, which seems fairly similar in some cases to homeschooling. We also told you, however, the next line of attack was that some people would become disordinately focused and characterise what I was saying as people being bred to be astronauts. I don't necessarily think that would have been so bad for me in life. But more than that, we think prodigies were real. You don't have to take what I said as being absolute, but from a young age, children start to differentiate and start to pursue different things. And we said that supporting children in that, beyond providing the minimum standards necessary that would help them engage in society with literacy, numeracy and civics, we provided for that. But we also told you at Ravi that in the worst case scenario, parents who were furious about the fact that they were being forced to send their children. And we accept this was a minority, but this was a very harmful minority because children were then stuck between what their parents told them at home, what they were told at school, and that led to bad outcomes for children who couldn't handle this. Socially, we told you it was better for children, particularly for children who suffered disabilities or came from minorities that meant they were bullied systematically at school. And they glibly asserted that bullying is good. We told you these are children, these are real human beings, and bullying at this early stage destroyed their ability to engage in education and their development. But more than that, we told you that in terms of socialisation, you got that best when they could become adjusted as children with a loving environment where they were raised, and that the stats bore it out, that at university in America, children who came from homeschooling were 50% more likely to engage in social activities at the uni than their counterparts. And finally, we also told you in the extreme case of cutting off from society, this was devastating, no response. So it was better for homeschooled kids, and that mattered. But in terms of what was better for society, they told us it would be better for other schools if we left parents to push for change. We said, well, clearly that's not working. That's why they pulled their children out. Secondly, we said that that leaves more resources for the children who are left behind in that system. And finally, we said that it was never acceptable to use children as the battering rams to bring about social change. We also told you that a society that mattered was one that respects religious freedoms. And they had a rant against religious indoctrination, while supporting religious schooling for majority religions. What we told you clearly is this was discriminatory against religious minorities that weren't fringe as they characterised them, but real and justified of a place in society that couldn't provide that religious learning for their children without it. More than that, we told you religious education wasn't bad. We told you that everyone has a right to a cultural and religious identity, and that being raised with that mattered, particularly when a state system was sometimes out to promote values that were counter. We showed you that social cohesion was better when you didn't force people together, but above all, we showed you respected individuals' rights, and in doing that, you got the best outcomes for all.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to call the final speaker of the debate, the affirmative reply, Matt.
Mr. Speaker, in this debate we recognise that education wasn't an end, but a means to social participation and individual self-actualisation. There were two issues. Firstly, individual choice and the role of the state, and secondly, what's best for the children. On the question of the role of the state and individual choice, we recognised from the outset that individual choice is seated in situations of demonstrable individual harm and for the purposes of social cohesion. We talked at length about the individual harms that are associated with homeschool, both in terms of education, in terms of knowledge and breadth, and also in terms of interpersonal skills. The basic value that was advocated on the other side of the house was this idea that parents have a right to inculcate children with their values. We had two responses to that point. Firstly, we said that that was necessarily a lower order right, that it was more important for children to have basic skills and interpersonal skills so that they could self-actualise in terms of their life. But secondly, we pointed out that that failed to engage with the proposition that education doesn't exclude parents from inculcating those values outside of regular hours in a classroom. It doesn't deny them that right that they saw as so valuable. There was a second level to this analysis, and that was that children will be torn, because they'll be exposed to something at home and then exposed to something in the classroom, and that will result in some terrible internal conflict. Matt convincingly pointed out that this kind of conflict is healthy in developing religious values, that it shows children the significance of their religion and why it differentiates them from others and leads to a more healthy value fundamentally. So on the second question of what was best for the children, the next case was premised on basically three assumptions. Firstly, the idea that children aren't denied access to opportunities, right? So they said at the beginning of the case that it's really good that parents can specialise and tailor their education. And that was kind of built on this premise that Victor said, that like effectively children at age 5 are capable of deciding what they want to do. We said that was unlikely to be the case and that the state was in a much better position because they have access to information and they understand the connection between education and employment and the skills that are needed. The second premise was the idea that parents are better placed to understand the needs of their children and educate them according to those needs. And we said that this wasn't necessarily the case, that one of the great values in education in a public system or a private system is the degree of objectivity and accountability that brings. That you can't effectively tailor an education to a child when you don't place that child in a context with their classmates and in a context within society. We said that education needed objectivity and that was fundamentally at the core of education. And thirdly, the premise that state schools were ineffective for a number of children. Now there were basically three areas of clash here. The first was the idea that services weren't available. What we said in response to this was that it was largely empirically false. We said that services existed for these children, that states were capable of modifying services. But more importantly, if their problem was access to services, we said, and this was underpinned by Cam's analysis, that if you pull these children out of state schools, that reduces services for everyone. On the second area of clash, there was an idea of quality. We said that it's necessarily better at state schools for reasons of accountability. And we also said that quality is improved when parents go into that classroom. Ravi wanted to assert that parents would feel under attack and disengaged from the school system. But we said that if the parents are really that concerned with children's development, that was unlikely to happen. And it also ignored the analysis that we provided about how parents can supplement the quality by educating children outside the classroom. But finally, on this idea of interpersonal skills, which was the last area of the ineffectiveness of state schools, this was underpinned by a glib assertion that bullying is harmful. We said that bullying was important, that it's better for a child to be bullied at 5 in a social context where they can develop resilience than to be shielded away until age 28 and then have to respond to bullying when they go out into society. At the end of this debate, we showed a clear imperative for state intervention. We showed that on all of the key harms, that children were better off out of home schools. And for that reason, we beg to propose this.